On the Biden front, though, this is very, very important news, which is that President Biden, for what, the 5th time now in his presidency, I want to say, or at least 3rd major high-profile time, has said now definitively that he, as the American president, would militarily defend Taiwan with U.S. troops. And then the White House changing their response, or changing and contradicting the president after he has said that now publicly. So let's take a listen to exactly what he said, and then I'll tell you what the White House said after.
But would U.S. forces defend the island?
Yes, if in fact there was an unprecedented attack.
After our interview, a White House official told us U.S. policy has not changed. Officially, the U.S. will not say whether American forces would defend Taiwan. But the commander-in-chief had a view of his own. So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
He said it as clear as day. He said it. He said it now 3 times.
Not leave himself any wiggle room, right? Because the first response was like, in the event of, what are you saying, unprecedented attack?
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you could spin that as oh, well, this attack didn't meet the standard of unprecedented. But at the end, he's like, so let's be clear, unlike Ukraine, where we didn't commit boots on the ground, with Taiwan you would. And he says flat out yes.
Right.
Then the White House once again, no, policy hasn't changed.
So let's reiterate
ambiguity, all of this.
The U.S. maintains strategic, this is from the U.S., from the State Department and from the White House, quote, the U.S. maintains strategic ambiguity on whether American forces would defend Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act obligates the U.S. to help equip Taiwan to defend itself. That's not congruent with what he said.
No.
This is like
the
whenever
two things cannot coexist.
This is like whenever he did the "by God, this man cannot remain in power," and
yes.
the White House is like, "Oh no, this is not a declaration of regime change in Russia." We're like, "Yeah, but he's the president. Like he's the one who gets to decide the policy." As far as I'm concerned, President Biden now has made it very clear exactly what he's going to do in Taiwan. And the reason why this is so dangerous is mixed signals when you're dealing with nuclear powers is the exact opposite of what you want to do. Okay, you said you're going to defend Taiwan, stick to it then. That's now the policy of the US government. Now you should maintain that. And at the very least, let's get the possible deterrent effect that may have in the future. But now, if you're Xi Jinping, you're like, what is the policy? Who is running the government? Because if I go, is Biden going to does he even run the government? Is it the White House? Like, you know, I mean, to them too, the idea that the American president can say something and then be contradicted by his own government, that makes no sense to the Chinese. So they're like, I don't know what the hell is happening here.
I was actually, after I read that piece about like Biden war and we don't want World War III and all this stuff, I was like, okay, like I've got some disagreements, but at least these things, and then I saw this and I was like, what the hell is going on here? I mean, this is insane. China is not Russia. Like the people who think we could do the same thing to China that we've done to Russia and like cut ourselves off economic. You're smoking something, because the level of economic interdependence between us and China, forget about it. I mean, did we not learn this lesson during the pandemic when it was like, oh, guess what? We don't have masks. Guess what? We don't have like enough like materials for the shots. We rely on them for everything, for gowns, for PPE, for everything. And you think that we're anywhere close to being able to have the same response with China that we have with Russia? That is bananas. Not to mention how many Americans are out there clamoring for a war with China. Like, you want to talk about World War III? Let's talk about a direct military conflict with China, which is exactly what he is floating, not just floating here, saying definitively that he is on board for. So this is insane. And then you add to it the total contradiction between what he's saying and then what the White House is trying to spin, and what it's a disaster.
My thing is like, look, if that's a policy, then you need to orient all U.S. forces towards that. This might, Bridge Colby, who we've had on the show, has discussed this. He's like, look, if that's actually the policy, he's like, you have to change literally everything about the U.S. military, about the U.S. alliance, about our economy. You need to prepare, like, all of this, because otherwise, if you stick by this policy, exactly for the reasons that you're saying, you could both possibly lose a war with China and you could suffer complete economic catastrophe. I mean, it would be an economic catastrophe regardless, just because of interdependence with Taiwan.
Absolutely.
The other problem, too, too, is that the spokesperson for the Chinese government, obviously, they see this and they're immediately saying that this is severely jeopardizing China-U.S. relations, stability in the Taiwan Strait. China is firmly opposed to this. And another problem is that I was reading actually very recently that ever since the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, once again, the Chinese government does not believe that the U.S. government had nothing to do with that visit. They're like, I don't believe that President Biden didn't want her to go.
I don't really believe it either.
I don't really know what. I mean, I think that she is enough of a narcissist to go.
I certainly don't blame China for reading it that way, because I'm not convinced that that Biden didn't greenlight it either.
Right. So like, I don't know. Anyway, if I'm the Chinese and I grew up in an authoritarian system, I'm like, I straight up just don't believe like so-called co-equal branches of government. So I get it from their perspective. And at the end of the day, their perspective, matters equally as much as ours does. Well, there has apparently been almost a near total diplomatic cutoff between Beijing and Washington ever since then. Remember when they fired those missiles into around the Taiwan Strait after the Pelosi visit, there was no military deconfliction pickup by the Chinese military. So once again, like, if you want that policy, I think that's fine. But then you need to be 100% committed to that, and then we should at very least get the deterrent effect and prepare the U.S. Armed Forces and the U.S. military and the U.S. population for democratic buy-in if such thing were going to happen. But you can't just offhand say these things like you did with regime change and then also have the White House directly contradict you. It's incredibly dangerous for the future. I really think it's more destabilizing as if he didn't just commit to it in the first place.
And I mean, I don't think it's fine in any regard. Even if we were like aggressively preparing our military or economy or whatever, we've taken some small tepid steps like the CHIPS Act towards being more economically, independent. That's good. But we are nowhere there, and I don't want a war with China. I don't want World War III.
No,
That's
it would be a disaster.
The bottom line here. And even the policy that we've sort of ramped up weapons shipments to Taiwan. I mean, now they feel like, okay, we've got a playbook with what we did in Ukraine, which again, even that, thinking that is insane, because China and Russia, totally different situation, but that seems to be what they're thinking. So they've ramped up weapons shipments to Taiwan, and even that is a really double-edged sword. Like, I understand the impulse of like, let's arm them so that they are really prepared in case there is some sort of invasion. But the other thing that can happen here, which may have been what happened with Ukraine, is that China feels like, oh, since we're arming them and we're shipping them all these weapons, making it more difficult for them, it's like, we got to go now or never, or else it's going to be more difficult. Because that's what some people think happened basically with Ukraine. When we started arming them, when we started training them, there was a sense of Putin of like, I've got to act now before they get further down this road and it becomes impossible to take over this country ultimately.
I think it's possible. I actually think it probably would have much less to do with us and a lot more to do with China and domestic political conditions there. I don't really think it would have as much to do with U.S. we've been arming the Taiwanese since like 1973. So, and nothing we're doing right now is unprecedented. More what it would be is if they genuinely believe that their moment is now and they have no other choice, and also to stick with the 2025 plan and the 100-year anniversary of like the CCP and Mao's, revolution. Or whatever. I think it would have a lot more to do with that. And it's also if he especially had economic collapse and they needed the population in China to be united around something. I mean, people forget this. Like, the Chinese population actually does really agree with the Chinese government on Taiwan. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's true.
Yeah,
it's like kind of in the way that, Russians believe that Ukraine really is an independent country. Most Russians believe that. Most Chinese also believe that about Taiwan. Like, the idea that they don't have domestic political support on this is very, very misguided. So they have their own domestic political concerns. I think that would probably fuel their thinking more than anything. Look, I honestly have no idea. I do think they probably had to learn something from Ukraine. I mean, they have to learn that it wouldn't be costless, that they couldn't just, quote unquote, get away with it. So anyway, I have no idea.
Troubling
situation.
We'll leave it at that. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.